Melissa Scaia. I'm a trainer and consultant and an employee of Domestic Abuse Project in Minneapolis. And I'm here to just do a quick short video that there are 3 different types of domestic violence. So I know that this term domestic violence is often a term used that's, to describe all acts of violence between intimate partners, family members, and household members. But it's really important in our field of work that we distinguish between 3 different types of domestic violence. Not all violence has the same source, it doesn't all have the same meaning, and it doesn't have the same effect. So it's important that we as interveners understand these 3 different types. The first type of domestic violence is what we call battering, or we call it coercive controlling violence and abuse. This is the sort of domestic violence that people in our work are most familiar with, of course. And so it's the one that is graphically displayed on the power and control wheel, but it includes physical violence, sexual violence, and of course, a number of controlling tactics that get used by abusers. This is most commonly sort of thought of in relationships of heterosexual intimate partner violence by men against women. However, it is possible, of course, that women, people who identify as non-binary, can also use this type of violence. The differences with this type of domestic violence is that the person is seeking to not just control a situation, but to control the thinking, the thoughts, everything about the other person. And so they really have a belief system that really has to work to be changed. And they really see the relationship as one where they're in charge, they're on top, meaning they get to make the decisions about their partner, and they really expect some level of submission by their partners. So that's the first type of domestic violence, is what we call coercive controlling violence and abuse, or otherwise known as battering. Our second type of domestic violence is a really important one for those of us like myself and Lisa Young-Lawrence, my good friend, who has done a lot of work on women's use of violence in particular. This is what we call resistive violence. And the reason why resistive violence is so important for us to understand is because if we have a survivor who is fighting back and we end up giving the impression to interveners, or we think of them as the same as the person who's abused us, we really jeopardize the safety of that survivor. So resistive violence is that second type, and that's when you have someone, it's usually what we would say in intimate partner heterosexual relationships, it's women. This is what's most common. And so what we will find is when you have the resistance to being abused, that many survivors will fight back. There are only a couple responses that survivors can really have when they're being abused. They can try and leave, which can be a challenge for them. They can resist or fight back. Or, what they can do is they can submit. And what we see with survivors is there's a whole wide range of responses. But when survivors do fight back, it's really important for us to understand that this is a very distinctive type of domestic violence and not the same. And so this is why we use this term resistive, is because what we know what survivors are doing is that they're resisting the abuse and violence and coercive control that they're living with and experiencing with. I also just want to say that this is also a common type of domestic violence that we'll see by children who live in homes with domestic violence as well. That children, particularly older children, will resist their experience of living in a home with battering or coercive controlling violence and abuse by fighting back. So it's important that we also understand their source of their violence and what they're doing. The third category is what we call violence unrelated to coercive control. So this is not someone who is trying to control their partner or who has a belief system that they're entitled to. This is not someone who's resisting. That this is really someone who can be in a couple of categories, that it's more of a situational type of domestic violence where there's not a pattern. It really was a singular incident of domestic violence. I have to say, though, that the challenge is that I used to go to criminal court all the time as an advocate. One of the things that we have to realize, of course, is that when you go to criminal court, what you end up seeing is a lot of abusers end up saying that this is the type of domestic violence that they were using, that they weren't trying to control their partner. It was a one-time situation. We would also say that in this category of violence unrelated to coercive control would be the type of domestic violence that only has to do with chronic or persistent mental illness or chronic and persistent substance use. Now, you will see a lot of substance use or mental illness in those first two categories. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about in this category that if they ended their use of substance, they don't have a belief system that's really driving their violence, or they're not a survivor who is trying, to fight back. So that's not in this group. But this is not mostly what we find in our intervention groups, is that, and we would say, and we should ask ourselves honestly, is if you have someone who is, that their use of violence is really tied to their mental illness or their substance use, should they be in our intervention groups? I want to just say that generally our experience, and this is anecdotal, speaking with a lot of people around the United States, Australia, England, for example, that most of what ends up in our criminal justice system is those first two categories. We will see cases, of course, that are in this third category, but it's much less. So that's just a quick overview of the three different types of domestic violence: coercive controlling violence and abuse, or otherwise known as battering, resistive violence, and then violence unrelated to coercive control or battery.